Welcome back to another episode of Ghost Countries. Today, we'll be covering our first crusader state, the Principality of Antioch. Antioch the city was founded by Seleucus around 300 BC, one of the so-called Diadochi, the generals, friends, and family of Alexander the Great, who came to rule parts of his once vast empire upon his death. Before this, however, a settlement had been founded in 307 BC by Antigonos, another Diadochi, but it was later abandoned. Seleucus called his new city Antiochia, after his father Antiochus. And it soon grew to be one of the biggest cities in the eastern Mediterranean. In 64 BC, the city came under Roman control, and later it would be designated as one of the 5 patriarchates, centers of early Christianity during the later Roman Empire, alongside Rome itself, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. But following 2 events, an earthquake in 526 and the Sasanian conquest of 540, the city began to decline. The 526 earthquake, which was followed by 18 months of aftershocks, was in particular devastating to Antioch, killing an estimated 250,000 people. Following this, the city was conquered by the Rashidun Caliphate, then reconquered by the Byzantines before falling into the hands of the Seljuks in 1085. A little over a decade later, in late October 1097, Antioch found itself again besieged, this time by a crusading army. But wait a second, let's take a step back. Since its founding in the 7th century, various Islamic powers, notably the previously mentioned Rashidun Caliphate, had come to control many parts of the eastern Mediterranean or Levant. This presented not only a political challenge, but also an ideological one for many Christian rulers back in Europe, especially the Pope. Losing territory is, not a good thing, all the more so during the medieval ages when your enemy is of a different faith. So, with the Seljuk Empire seemingly distracted following the death of Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, the empire's de facto ruler, which in turn led to regional instability threatening Christian populations and pilgrims, Pope Urban II demanded the support of the Byzantine Emperor in reconquering the Holy Land to safeguard Christendom itself. This call to arms was enthusiastically received across Europe, which resulted in an unprecedented mobilization of people from all walks of life in what later came to be known as the First Crusade. Marching through Anatolia following the siege of Nicaea and the Battle of Dyrrhachium, the Crusaders arrived in Antioch in 1097. Okay, so the crusading army led by, a lot of people, was outside Antioch, but there was a problem. The city had pretty robust defensive capabilities with more than 400 watchtowers and a thick outer wall. The Crusaders managed to enter the city after establishing contact with an Armenian guard known as Firuz, who allowed a small contingent of the besieging force to scale a tower under his command, thereafter opening a nearby gate and overwhelming the city's garrison. What followed can be described as little else other than a bloodbath, with the Crusaders massacring thousands of Christian and Muslim civilians, including Firuz's own brother. However, it soon became known that a Seljuk relief army from Mosul was fast approaching, which numbered somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 men. This was a bit of a problem, seeing as the Crusaders numbered around just 20,000, including non-combatants. Because of this, more than a few decided to, desert. And rather interestingly, while fleeing, they ran into an army commanded by the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I, who himself was headed east to assist the Crusaders. Much to his shock, the deserters told him the city was lost and all the Crusaders therein were dead. And so, Alexios decided to turn back as well. Meanwhile, back east, however, the second siege of Antioch was in full swing. Inside the city, morale was at an all-time low. That is, until June 15th, when a priest from southern France, who had a vision of St. Andrew, convinced a group of crusaders to dig in a cathedral, discovering the Holy Lance of Longinus within the city. The Holy Lance being a relic that was supposedly part of a lance used by an unnamed Roman soldier, later referred to as Longinus, to stab Jesus in his side after crucifixion, so as to check whether he was dead. Just a bit of a side note here, but it apparently was rather common for the starving crusaders in Antioch to have visions or hallucinations, with there being multiple reports of those claiming to have witnessed Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, or as occurred on June 14th, a meteor landing in the besieging Seljuk encampment. Anyway, Even though some of the Crusaders' leaders were suspicious of the relic's sudden discovery, many of the common soldiers believed it a divine sign, and that proved an enormous morale boost. And so, on June 28th, the still outnumbered Crusaders emerged from the city, carrying the Holy Lance, and attacked the Seljuks. Rather miraculously, they won, with the soldiers later reporting an army of saints had come to their aid in battle. After this victory, the Crusaders headed south to conquer Jerusalem, and in 1098, following a lengthy dispute, Bohemond of Taranto, Italy, a giant of a man, became the first Prince of Antioch. This, however, wasn't exactly what they had agreed to when passing through Constantinople. Rather, they had sworn an oath to hand over control of Antioch and the surrounding territories to Alexios I upon their conquest. But now, the Crusaders had other plans. Bohemond moved quickly to establish what soon came to be referred to as the Principality of Antioch, and, in doing so, got into conflict with the Danishmends, a Seljuk vassal. In 1100 AD, he was captured in battle and spent the next 3 years in prison. Meanwhile, his nephew Tancred became regent and immediately set about expanding the principality's borders, seizing the cities of Tarsus and Latakia from the Byzantines. However, thanks to a certain Baldwin II of Edessa, yet another crusader state to have popped up in the wake of the First Crusade, a ransom for Bohemond was paid and he was released in 1103. So, just for a bit of historical background here, the county of Edessa, its capital being a city of the same name located in what nowadays is southeastern Turkey, was created just some months prior to the Principality of Antioch, and the aforementioned Baldwin had become the Count of Edessa in 1098. Later, he would go on to become king of yet another crusader state, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Together with Baldwin II of Edessa and Tancred, Bohemond of Antioch marched to Edessa in 1104 to relieve the city, then under siege by Jakirmish of Mosul. Upon their arrival, the Seljuks feigned a retreat until arriving at a plain opposite the city of Raqqa. Here, the Battle of Harran took place, and it proved a decisive Seljuk victory. What's more, Baldwin II was captured, while both Bohemond and Tancred were forced to flee with what remained of their forces in defeat. Taking advantage of the situation, the Byzantine Empire then reconquered Latakia and parts of Cilicia. Towns across the principality also rose up in rebellion, and many were, in turn, reoccupied by Muslim forces. In short, the Battle of Harran had dramatic and arguably irreversible consequences for the two crusader states involved, with Edessa never really recovering from its defeat. However, due in part to internal divisions among the various Muslim powers, the county did manage to survive for the time being. Bohemond, searching for reinforcements, traveled back to Italy where he recruited and hired new soldiers for his return to Antioch. But his plans kind of changed, and instead Bohemond attacked the Byzantines in 1107. Leading an army some 34,000 men strong, Bohemond entered Greece and laid siege to Dyrrhachium. But Alexios managed to block the invading army's supply line, which led to negotiations. This resulted in the Treaty of Devol, which basically made Bohemond and the Principality of Antioch a vassal of the Byzantine Empire. And so with that, our story comes to an end. Wait, what? No. Yeah, so there's just one thing. Bohemond never returned to Antioch, opting to remain in Italy where he eventually died in 1111. And without him, the actual ruler, having returned to Antioch, the treaty was therefore considered null and void. So basically, Alexios was scammed once more by the Crusaders, and the Principality of Antioch remained independent. What's more, it had the backing of the County of Tripoli and Kingdom of Jerusalem. So yeah, not a good deal for the Byzantines. A year later, however, Tancred died, and was succeeded by Bohemond's son, Bohemond II. The only problem was that he was still too young to govern, and so Tancred's nephew, Roger of Salerno, was declared regent of Bohemond II. Basically, everything stayed the same despite a generational turnover. In 1119, though, Roger was killed during the so-called Battle of the Field of Blood, which resulted in Antioch becoming a vassal of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, then ruled by Baldwin II. And yes, that is the same Baldwin who was captured by the Seljuks in 1104. Then, Bohemond II died in 1130, after only having ruled the Principality of Antioch for just 4 years. But, during this time, he had married the daughter of Baldwin II, Alice of Jerusalem, with whom he had his one and only child, a daughter named Constance. What happened to the principality following his death? Well, until 1136, Baldwin's successor, Fulk of Jerusalem, acted as regent of the principality. Then, in 1136, the 10-year-old Constance married Raymond of Poitiers, then aged 36. Raymond, the new ruler of Antioch, decided to attack Cilicia to the Principality's north, which was then still controlled by the Byzantines. This somewhat understandably angered the Byzantine Emperor, John II Komnenos, who after having defended his territory, marched on Antioch. In 1138, he arrived outside the city's walls and compelled Raymond to swear fealty to him, which effectively made the Principality of Antioch a Byzantine vassal yet again. Thereafter, the Principality participated in a joint campaign with the Byzantine Empire and County of Edessa against the Seljuks, in which it experienced a degree of success, conquering a number of fortresses. Despite this, it is said that while the Byzantine Emperor fought hard, Raymond and the Count of Edessa were rather disinterested in military affairs, reportedly even playing dice during the siege of Shaizar. A riot, likely instigated by the Count of Edessa, then occurred in Antioch, forcing the Byzantine Emperor to leave the city. Of course, he planned to return, but died before he could in 1143. A year later, in 1144, Edessa fell to Muslim forces. This was particularly bad news for the Principality since Edessa had acted kind of as a bulwark against hostile forces to the east. In 1146, following the assassination of Ahmad al-Din Zengi, the Atabeg or governor of Mosul and Aleppo, by a slave, the Count of Edessa tried reclaiming the city. He received no support from other crusader states in what was an admittedly poorly planned expedition, and the city was recaptured by Zengi's son, Nur ad-Din. Edessa's Christian population was then massacred, enslaved, and/or exiled while trying to flee the city. The city itself, thereafter, basically was abandoned. But what was going on in Antioch? Well, the Principality seemed to be losing ever more territory in the east, and if things couldn't get worse, in 1149, Raymond died in the Battle of Inab. Raymond's widow, Constance, then remarried Ranald of Châtillon. And, I might be repeating myself here, he got into conflict with the Byzantines, now led by Manuel I Komnenos. In 1158, Antioch became a vassal of the Byzantines again. This arrangement came to an end when Manuel died 12 years later in 1180. Although the Principality of Antioch might have weathered the coming storm a bit better under Byzantine rule, for you see, in the years since the fall of Edessa, the previously mentioned Nur ad-Din had become an ever greater threat to the Crusader states. However, thanks to protection provided by the Byzantines, Antioch had not yet been conquered during one of his many campaigns in the region. And speaking of Nur ad-Din, which means light of the faith in Arabic, there is a little side story that I'd like to tell you. When the king of Jerusalem, Baldwin III, died in 1163, Nur ad-Din said, "We should sympathize with their grief and in pity spare them, because they have lost a prince such as the rest of the world does not possess today." Even though the kingdom of Jerusalem was weakened by the death of Baldwin III, Nur ad-Din did not attack due to his respect for the now late king. Nur ad-Din himself would die 11 years later in 1174, having essentially united the various Muslim states in the region. But for the Crusader states, a new enemy was waiting at the gates, Salah ad-Din, also known as Saladin. Husband to Nur ad-Din's widow, Ismat ad-Din Khatun, Saladin would become one of the most well-known generals of the Islamic world, renowned for his wisdom, mercy, as well as being a skillful general who fought in the upcoming Third Crusade against yet another well-known historical figure, Richard the Lionheart, King of England. In 1187, Saladin besieged the city of Antioch. However, with naval assistance provided by the Italian city-states, it was able to withstand Saladin's push into the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Interestingly, the Principality of Antioch and County of Tripoli both refused to take part in the Third Crusade. By now, Antioch was under the control of Bohemond III, and his son, whose name was surprisingly, just wait for it, Bohemond, became Count of Tripoli following the Battle of Harran in 1187. 14 years later, in 1201, Bohemond III died, and as a result of his death, a power struggle occurred in the Principality. His son declared himself Prince of Antioch in 1207 and took the name Bohemond IV. But his nephew, Raymond Rupen of Armenia, also claimed the throne and even managed to briefly rule his rival from 1216 to 1219. Bohemond IV was eventually able to regain his throne, but he died in 1233. Following this, none of the rulers of Antioch really played an important role in the later Crusades or regional affairs. In time, a marriage between yet another Bohemond, Bohemond VI, and an Armenian princess, Sibylla, was arranged, creating an alliance between the two states. In reality, however, the Armenians, with their base in Cilicia, were significantly more powerful than the Principality of Antioch, which essentially became a vassal state. A few years later, the Mongols arrived on scene. Antioch later submitted to the Mongols, becoming a tributary state in 1260, and alongside the Armenians would assist their new overlord in conquering what is today Syria. In time, however, the Mongols' main regional rival, the Mamluks, gained the upper hand following the Battle of Ain Jalut. A few years later, in 1268, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars laid siege to, conquered, and eventually sacked Antioch. And this brought a definitive end to the Principality of Antioch, a fate shared by the other Crusader states a few years later.